All right. So as I was saying, this talk was requested by Monica. So, and this is, I've proposed a series now. Hold on. A series called APA Manual Snooze Fest or Treasure Chest, because you just think, oh man, I don't need that thing. Here it is. It's just, they're telling me how to format my references or something. But by the way, I really like this spiral one, and it has the tabs in it, so it can just get you to where you need to go. It is a lot more than people might think that it is. It has the answers to lots of questions that graduate students have when they're working on their dissertation, for instance. And so I've proposed a list of different talks that I'll do based on the APA manual. And one of them, actually, I will say now, is for the KISS PAM group, because I was looking, I'll send you out the page numbers and stuff. I think it's something like somewhere around page 100 or so. They have reporting standards. Let's see, it's in the journal article reporting standards, which is a tab here, JARS. And then it is, okay, it's 82 to 86. They have quantitative method standards and qualitative method standards. And I'd like that group to read this. I'll send you the info. It can actually tell you some things while you're deciding what method to use for your research, because it tells you what you have to have in the write-up. And you can decide, do I have that, or does this fit what we're doing, before, instead of doing it later when you've already done the study and then you think, uh-oh, I don't think I have that, or I'm not sure if I can make that argument. So we are still using the 7th edition. In fact, the 7th edition was a big deal when it came out in, is it 2019? Something like that. They don't, let me look in the.
It came out after 2019, because when I came back for the PhD program and submitted my first paper, I had so many things wrong because I assumed it was still the same.
Yes, I looked here, it's 2020. I remember. So there, I went to the 2019 APA conference in, I think it was in Chicago. And there was a man in a character costume dressed as the APA manual with like this little arm coming out. Hey, everybody, here's me. And I was like, oh my God, I love him. I'm such a fan. But really, they don't put a new edition out that often because it's a massive undertaking. But there are some actual shockers in the APA manual. Maybe the most shocking to me is using the first person now. We can do a future thing on that, but that was absolutely verboten for the entire time I've studied psychology and then been a psychologist. And now we've decided to do it. I get it, but it'll take people a while to catch up because they're so used to doing it the other way, trying to avoid saying anything about themselves personally. Okay, so the American Psychological Association publishes this manual, and this is a writing style. Style means a lot of things. It includes the fact that, for instance, you cannot use poetic language when you're writing an APA style. That's a whole topic in and of itself, but these rules are telling you how to write up research reports in psychology. And as I'm sure you know, people use APA style outside of psychology as well. It's a widely used style. There are certain styles like AMA style, American Medical Association, that just lots of people will use that style, a group of people, MLA for literature, modern languages. So it's a style in that when you're in that discipline or that set of disciplines, all the papers are formatted that way. Formatted like it has a reference section, it has an introduction, that sort of thing. But also written in that style meaning stylistic way of approaching this type of writing. So it's a type of writing, and it has rules for how you can express yourself. It values things like being very direct and clear and using the most powerful words that express what you're trying to say. including the terms for things, which would be called jargon outside of this, but this is written professionally. So terms like identification or third person effect or whatever, those terms, because that's precisely what you mean. So it's about precision. It's about economy of language. So there are things that you just in the style of APA shouldn't do. And it varies by type of article. So I'll go into that, but it's clear, concise, and it is a research report. If you write a book, you can be more conversational, more less formal, things like that. But what we're trying to do is get across precisely what the research was, why it was conducted, that there's evidence that this was needed, and what results you found. So, and there are different types, 10, nice round number. They have, ooh, this is sorry, it's blurrier than I thought it was when I saw it in a small version. This is just from the inside of, I've got it on here, but my picture's in the way. Sorry. The principles tab. So this blue tab on here says principles. And if you crack it open on yours, what I did is just take a shot with my phone of the 10 types of articles. It's right there. So it doesn't have a page number, but it's right before chapter 1. So sorry, that's blurry. I'll try to fix that later. But I'm going to go through these different 10 things that you might write as a professional. Again, these are article links and they're scientific papers. It doesn't mean that you can't write a blog or a short story or any number of things. A book would be the most obvious one for a scientist. But these are the rules designed for research. Research reports is a term that you could use for many of these. So the first several on the list, let me just jog back to that. Quantitative, qualitative, mixed, and replication articles. They're called articles. They're called articles actually once they're published in a peer-reviewed journal. They're called manuscripts before they're published. So the Word document version of that is the manuscript. And that's the language that's used in the systems where you use to publish. It's like a popular media. We use one of the big ones, Editorial Manager, and everything in it says manuscript. Submit your manuscript to the journal because it's a manuscript until it's published, and then it's an article. So empirical articles. Empirical means from observation, just generally. It's another way of saying it's a research report. Research, there's two big meanings for research. One of them is the way we mean it, which is I've designed a study and I've gathered data. Another typical word for research is I've done what I call library research, background research. This means data collection. So research reports, a report of an empirical investigation, which includes new data. So you've done an original study. It's original to you. You created it. It's new. It's not been previously published in a peer-reviewed journal. And empirical articles, journal articles, are considered our primary source material. You are obliged, like a lot of things in the AP manual are obligations. I'm just going to use that term because I was raised Catholic. Holy day of obligation. You are obliged, no matter what your religion or lack thereof, to cite primary source material. Obviously, if you just cited Wikipedia throughout the whole thing, and I'm not dissing on Wikipedia, that would be not okay. Not previously published in a peer-reviewed journal is important because, for instance, your dissertation will be published by ProQuest theses and dissertations. It's not peer-reviewed. It's a special kind of thing because it has it is peer-reviewed by your committee and approved by your committee, but that's not the same thing as blind peer-reviewed because the whole idea is quality control. Both procedures are for quality control, but in order to make it into print, the idea is the reviewers didn't know who you are, so they're blind to that, hoping that that's going to be relatively unbiased. The journal is selective, so it's not easy to get things published. And the things that are published are deemed to be of high quality. Of course, no system is perfect, but it goes a long way towards not only just picking the things that are already good, but making them better in the process.
Good attention.
And if you have questions as we're going through, go right ahead. The names of the types of articles, qualitative, quantitative, etc., those are actually based on research designs. So it's saying that one type of article uses the research design, a research design which is qualitative, a research design which is quantitative, or mixed, or is a replication. So those are just some broad classifications. So I don't know if I have a definition in here, but quantitative involves numbers, qualitative, I think I do have a definition, doesn't involve numbers, and it involves language and analysis in a specific way. Mixed is not mixed as in the statistical analysis, but there's mixed designs, but mixed research design in that it uses both specifically qualitative and quantitative elements, or replications, and I think I do have these defined, so I'll go to the next slide. So, as I said, quantitative involves numbers. These are designs. The traditional designs, the most commonly published ones are correlational studies, models that include intercorrelations. Those are regression models, structural equation models, correlational, causational studies that can detect causation, which would be experiments, or cross-leg panel designs, which is a pattern of correlations over time. Yeah, anything that involves data collection from people of numbers, but also content analysis. This is pretty particular to us, media psychologists, because I was not trained to do any content analysis. Content analysis can be quantitative or qualitative, but I taught myself to do them because I think they're valuable. And people do them in media, in mass comm all the time. They are a quantitative type of research report. So it involves numbers. A paper that is quantitative has what's called an IMRD format, which is your old friends, the intro, method, results, and discussion. There's a whole list of things that start from the title page, the abstract, the intro, et cetera, and they go on to figures, tables, appendices, but the IMRD part is the main body of any kind of empirical research report. So there's that. That's a quantitative. So in psychology, generally, quantitative pieces are the most common. Then there's qualitative, which also is empirical, original. It focuses on things like words, language, interactions, artistic presentations. The language is kind of central to it, and it's also central that you're trying to get to the rich experience of individuals. I was always taught by all the readings that I've done and people I've heard speak that you are not supposed to generalize from anything qualitative. So if you have 6 people who you've interviewed in depth and you're analyzing the text, the language, trying to basically summarize the experience. So instead of just having pages of interview text, you, the expert, are summarizing that text for people to say what happened in there, looking for themes, looking for interesting things about the language. But again, it's supposed to be about the rich experience of the person. And so you're not supposed to be trying to generalize. So you can actually switch methods. You can switch your approach between participants because you're not trying to make it the same for them. You can do a lot of things that are not okay in quantitative. So qualitative is type of research report, or mixed. So you want to explain in your write-up of a mixed methods paper why you're not just doing it because it's kind of a trend. It's kind of a cool thing to do. Let's just all mix our methods. It really is. There's trends, you know, we're people, so we have trends. So there's trends towards mixed methods, which I think is good because it's probably a step towards saying we're going to more wholly accept qualitative research. In some quarters of psychology, it is not valued, and it's still numerically, that's ironic, less than quantitative research, but there are many enthusiasts, and myself being one of them. I've definitely published qualitative research, although honestly mine veers toward the quantitative analysis of qualitative data, which is fine. But you're supposed to say, why are you doing this? Like with any method, why is it correlational? Why is it a model? Why is it experimental? Why is it mixed? What's the value add of having both approaches? And how does your, what is the narrative of your idea, given that you want to have this rich experience explained of individuals and something, let's say, that's predictive? How do those two things relate to each other? And of course, if you did them separately, in turn, then, for instance, the individual experience of people might give you an idea for something that would be a predictive model, like a correlational study. So those are just saying, here's some research methods, like all of those different types of articles are saying, there's different types of research that we do and value and acknowledge, and these are them. So you might be doing that. Replications, that's an interesting one. Over time, there's been a problem with not publishing null effects, for instance, because the idea was we have to demonstrate that things are different. But now we try to put value on null effects. There are whole journals to do with null effects. All replications are certainly not of null effects. Replications are just what it sounds like, that you're replicating a study that's been done in the past. It could be a direct replication, like you're literally trying to do it as close as possible to what they did. It can be an approximate one where you change the measures, change the participants, something like that. It can be a conceptual replication in that you're replicating the measurement of the conceptual variables. So it's more broad. It's not methodologically directly the same. But again, like null effects, replications have been hard to publish because we're always pushing people to come up with something new, but then we're skipping the part where we verify, data. If there's only one study can never stand completely alone. So you need to have replications. And if there's a problem replicating effects over time, we want that to show up so we can look for the reason and try to figure out what it all means. So again, those are all things that you would submit to a journal. And we talked earlier about selecting a journal, and I mentioned journals have aims and scope. And so you can read in there, and sometimes they will tell you they publish replications, they publish qualitative research, whatever it is that you're looking to publish. Hopefully that's in the aims and scope. So here's, this is weird for me. This is a double picture of Harris Cooper. So when I was in graduate school in social psych at the University of Missouri, Columbia, one of my professors was Harris Cooper. On the left is what he looked like when I was there. On the right is what he looks like now, just in case you see a picture of him. He's let his beard grow out. So I just wanted to make that clear. Harris was always a big, mega researcher. He is known in part for meta-analysis. So Bob Rosenthal, a famous social psychologist, basically developed meta-analysis, but Harris was with him in graduate school at the time and was there when meta-analysis was being developed. And so he learned from the originator, and he also contributed to what we know today as meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is a statistical literature review. That means that instead of individual data points from people, the individual data point in a meta-analysis is a number from a study. A single study is that unit of analysis, and it uses effect sizes. And basically what it's doing is, if I want to know something like what's the effect size of narrative transportation, I would do what Holly's doing in her dissertation, where you find an entire literature, and then that is a difficult thing to do. And then you gather from those studies the effect sizes, and you perform computations on them. And then you're able to say, across 100 studies, here's the effect size of, what I say, transportation. What's the, so if there's a meta-analysis of your topic of interest, definitely want to take a look at that. And meta-analyses are something that's very handy to be able to do, to know that method, because literature reviews in general are highly citable, highly useful, and just very strong contributions. So, you know, if I get a meta-analysis submitted to me at the journal, I will think automatically something in its favor is the fact that it's a meta-analysis, because it's going to do more in a way than any single study can do, because it's going to collapse across a lot of studies. So it's just a matter of practicing the technique. And then also you don't need participants, because again, you're gathering studies, not individual reactions. I have a little thing in here. I'll post the PowerPoint, but Harris, he's a journal editor and all edited many books and written many books, but he had a blog from a while back about avoiding plagiarism. I just put the link in there. And this is a slide that has a bunch of Harris's books. And so if you're interested in meta-analysis, I would definitely recommend Harris's books. So the biggest picture here is his step-by-step approach. Then we have a newer one that has multi-authors handbook of meta-analyses. A meta-analysis is also called a research synthesis. So that's why it's in the title there. He has a research book there, Critical Thinking About Research and Psychology and Related Fields. And then I did not know this until I just looked him up on Amazon, but I'm like, is that the same Harris Cooper? Apparently he wrote a book called American History Through a Whiskey Glass. He's an interesting person. So how distilled spirits, domestic cuisine, and popular music help shape a nation. So go Harris, he's always up to something. So that's meta-analysis. I have had one student at Fielding do a dissertation that was a meta-analysis, and she had a meta-analysis expert as her external examiners. Actually, I wrote Harris and I said, you're probably busy, but do you have a student, you know, former student or something who could be the external? And he gave me her name, so she was the external. Okay. Deep breaths. Literature reviews. So a meta-analysis is a literature review. Another type of paper that you could write, and it doesn't involve you gathering data from people, like, you know, completing surveys or being interviewed, that sort of thing. Again, this is it's more meta. It's literally more meta. That's why it's a meta-analysis. It's more meta because you're going broad over a literature. So it's a bit confusing because the term literature review is two major things in our field. So it is both a type of article and it is a subsection of your introduction of an empirical article. So this is confusing. And they're not that different. They're different, but they're not wholly different. So in your introduction, you are going to review the literature of related research that is related to your study. That's what you're trying to do. So in the intro, you're saying, I'm going to tell you what you need to know that has already been done that's adjacent to what I'm doing, both the theory and the specific findings. That's a literature review. Anytime you go over literature, you're reviewing literature. Literature, we know, but I'll say it anyway. It is for us a body of published empirical articles. It's the primary research that we were talking about, a set of primary research. The term literature review for a type of article, that means that the entire article is a literature review and it's more broad than the type that goes inside a paper. So A literature review that we usually just, when we're saying the words literature review, is a narrative literature review. It's narrative as opposed to statistical. A meta-analysis is a statistical literature review, and a literature review is a narrative literature review. So, meta-analysis, like I said, my high school, that'd be great if Harris was in my high school. My grad school professor, there it is, Harris Cooper. I said he was around when Bob Rosenthal developed the meta-analysis. So, it hasn't been around for that long, whereas narrative literature reviews have been around for a long time. So before we did the math, we just told the story. You're still telling the story in a meta-analysis, but with numbers. So I think I have this in here somewhere, but there's a great paper. Do I have this on the next slide? Yeah, there's a great paper article, excuse me, by Roy Baumeister and Mark Leary, two big social psychologists. It tells you what a high class, a highly professional literature review should have in it. So this is from the APA manual. These are quotes. A narrative literature review provides a narrative summary and evaluation of the findings or theories within a literature base. Literature reviews capture trends and they can identify problems. So I'm writing a literature review right now about all the published empirical work on anything that has to do with connecting to fictional characters. And so that includes identification and parasocial phenomena and liking and similarity. Anything that we have measured in this literature that come under the umbrella of connecting with characters. I'm using those literatures and I'm making arguments about things like a problem is there's a definition of identification, but we're not all using it. And we're also, some of us are using the terms that Jonathan Cohen, author of Identification Theory, specifically said are not identification. Some of us are measuring identification as liking, as similarity, as parasocial phenomena. So these are the arguments I'm making in my, it's a theoretical paper and it's also a literature review. So there's also, let's see, I think I have this here. For anyone, undergrads or anyone, there's Jose Galvan has written Writing Literature Reviews. It's from Pearsack Publishing. That is a very difficult word to say, but I can give you the info on that. It's a general introduction to what literature reviews are supposed to do. I do recommend it to grad students too, just to make sure that they understand what it means to review a literature. So in a literature review, it's not just a summary of what has happened. That's more like a student paper. A student paper is saying, here are some findings that we know about identification, for example. In a professional level literature review, there's definitely an argument. The argument may be more or less subtle, but it is the voice of the author. You are supposed to be the expert who is telling us something that is useful to know about this literature. So my late colleague, Don Polkinghorn, would say, don't write a book report. And what he meant was, don't just read 10 articles and say, well, Joe said this and Sally said that. That's all good, but you're a professional, so you put it together, you synthesize it, you make a professional set of comments on it. So it has to be your voice making those comments. You have to have a command of the literature and you have to add value to the literature. Now, I'm going to make a comment here so I don't forget it later. Number 10 is student papers. Let me say what's different from a student paper and a professional literature review. I think, Perry, you were mentioning this the other day. It's so crucial to know. When you write a student paper, you are reviewing a literature, but you have much lower responsibility, especially if you're an undergrad, than you would have as a professional scholar. So let's say I'm going to write, I'm an undergraduate student, I'm going to write a paper about body image. really, all the professor expects me to do is get some research about body image and write about it. Like I'm just supposed to demonstrate as a student that I know what literature is, I've read it, I can kind of tell you what some of these findings were, but there's no level of responsibility for it being systematic, professionally astute, a commentary from the student. Um, it's the stepping stone to later more professional work. So you can grab whatever literature. I mean, I was a professor for undergrads. I've read many a paper on body image and other things. And, I'm just looking for them to have found some journal articles about it and to tell me what happened in them. And it's fine if they just say the author said this, the author said that. That's what Don Polkinghorne meant by a book report. You're just reporting what happened. But that's as you move from undergrad to grad and then grad to professional, what you're doing is more like taking command of that literature and taking responsibility for your own perspective, and having something to contribute to the literature. And those are all big jobs, and they feel strange sometimes as you're going through the steps, because you want to make sure you're not plagiarizing. You want to make sure you're giving credit to the authors for their ideas. And if you haven't really found your voice or your feet, you'll feel weird making commentary on your views. Some people do, some people don't. It all depends. But that's one of my goals as I help support people in their writing, is to give them permission to go ahead and use their voice and make comments. And I know if you're a clinical psychologist and you're just taking my social psych class, grad class, for instance, that's not even your area. So you may just feel like all I can do is sort of give some comments, but I mean, just give a report. But I try to support people in saying, here's why I know you're not plagiarizing. Here's why. Here's what it's okay to say. Here are some tips for how to write that way. One way to write more like a professional is to put the ideas first and put the authors second. This is a continuum. It's fine to say, Melanie Green said this about transportation because she is one of the original authors, but you also can have views on transportation. And so if you look at published articles, usually the authors talk about ideas first and authors in a secondary way. And that's the way it's sort of meant to be. We're in the business of ideas, and it's important who the key scholars are, but it's not the main point. So yeah, a literature review has you are contributing to knowledge. Okay, so theory paper, that's another one you can do. Some of these blend together. In fact, I'm going to talk about Holly's dissertation in this area too. It's a literature review. Depending on how far it goes, it could be a theory paper. It relates to methods too, which is another category. So sometimes these are a little bit, which one is it most? It's mostly a literature review and a content analysis of a literature, counting the number of articles that use Jonathan Cohen's measure of identification, for instance. But I'm going to move on to theory paper. So I'm starting with what's a theory. I had this question when I was in undergrad, and I completely understand it. People will ask me, how many theories do I need to talk about in the intro to my study? It's not a number. It's about what you're doing with the theory. The number usually relates to what variables you're measuring, because you might have a different theory for the independent variable and a different one for the dependent variable. But so what's a theory? I once asked my mentor about this, and he said, really, it's not that you are saying something that hasn't been said necessarily. It is you're helping your colleagues organize their research. So think about it this way, you're saying, and therefore you will do this and this. So in my theory paper, one of the things I'm saying is, think about the fact that identification and parasocial phenomena are part of an umbrella under connections with characters, and that we don't only identify or only have a parasocial relationship. We move dynamically. We switch perspectives, probably rapidly sometimes. So those are just my way of saying, here's how it's really organized. Here's the umbrella. Here's something about how quickly we do it. It's not locked into only one or only this. So I'm saying, therefore, study it that way. That's a theoretical paper because I'm trying to organize thinking about it, organize the relationship between these different related variables, press people to use the correct definition and the correct term at the correct time. A theory is about the relationship between variables. So like temperature and aggression, the theory is if you're uncomfortable, you'll be more aggressive. So if I'm uncomfortably cold, if I'm uncomfortably hot, leaning more towards uncomfortably hot. I think I mentioned this recently. Leonard Berkowitz had a book on aggression, and one of the chapters was titled "We're Nasty When We Feel Bad." And then he went forward to say, here's some ways in which we feel uncomfortable. It's too hot, it's too crowded, it's stinky, literally, those are environmental instigations to aggression. So the theory says, if it's hot and crowded, I'm more likely to be aggressive than if it's comfortable temperature and not crowded. So it lets you make a prediction. That's what your theory and your research should do. It should help you predict how your variables are related to each other. And that is why you are putting it in there. It's not, the literature review in your paper is not just some coverage casually of studies in that general family. It's a pointed argument leading to the specific study you're doing. It's offering evidence, and it is saying why the theory helps make the prediction. So interestingly, to me anyway, these elements are in any empirical paper, but some papers just drill down, like they just drill down to the theory, for instance. I'll pause here. Questions, comments?
A helpful article that helped me for this one was Susan Fisk's Mind the Gap.
Yep.
And that really helped me think about how writing about theory is different from just using theory or making hypotheses in relation to your specific situation.
Yep, I'm glad I have that in social psych class. She's an amazing theorist, Susan Fisk. Her models of stereotype content model, she does this absolutely to a T. She tells you how it predicts behavior, how it predicts emotions, how it predicts thoughts, which are stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. So she follows that out really completely. And she says things like, your experience, your personal experience can inform theory. It's not that you have to divorce yourself from real life, but then you have to go back to the literature and see what's there. So theoretical articles, they are normally written by someone who's been publishing empirical articles in the field, although your reviewer should not know whether you have or not, because they're blind to your identity. They're helping advance theories. They're helping trace the development of the theory. These are all quotes from the APA manual. They're expanding and refining its constructs. Sometimes they present a new theory, and sometimes they analyze the existing theory. And I've given examples of that, so I won't redo them. But I'll just point to the reason that I rely heavily on Cohen 2001 is because it is a major theoretical article, and no other specific empirical article could take its place because it's the theoretical article. So it doesn't matter that Jonathan Cohen has published many empirical articles since then. Now you can jump forward into his more recent publications and find what he is currently saying in the intro, but still that 2001 paper is going to continue to be cited because that's a theoretical article. That's when he said, here's the problem, blah, 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 and here's what I'm suggesting. And I'm saying there's a theory of identification with characters. So again, theory papers are highly published, highly cited. I'm not going to be, this is not meant to be mean or something. They're just in ways they are more valuable than any single empirical paper. Like a single empirical paper are the bricks in the wall, of science, we have to have them, but someone has to stop and give us the big picture as well. If you just did only studies and never thought across them, sometimes we do that and then people say, wait a minute, why are we doing that? Okay, so a methodological study. There are whole journals that are just about methods in psychology. And, method, that's self-explanatory what it would be, but it could be, I'll give you an example. I once did a study which found null results and never was published, but it involved me and my friend Jimena going into my daughter's school and sitting in the computer lab with kindergarten children while they played Dora the Explorer video games. So although I got no publication out of that, it was adorable. So, but in that study, I had never done research collecting data from 5-year-olds before, and I'm not a developmental psychologist, so I hadn't thought about it a lot before, but I needed to get their responses to some items. And so instead of giving them a Likert type scale with words, where they can click on, for kids, people have developed methods like smiley face, frowny face, or, bars that move and stuff. So a method for developmental psychologists would be adapting what we do with adults for children. For us in media psych, it could be using media in ways to get at certain questions, using specific hardware or software. It could be like a procedure, like maybe you're using deception and you want to figure out how to make that sort of authentic but not unethical. Anything where you're saying, here's how I get data from these specific people. Here's how I conduct interviews with these specific people. Here's how I measure this thing. It could be like psychophysiological. That would make a lot of sense. Like GSR is a psychophysiological measurement. So here's the device. Here's how you hook up people to it. Those kind of specifics. So if you have a way of measuring something, it could be like putting people in an fMRI and looking at what parts of their brains light up when they do a certain thing. That's a methodological study. It's just telling people, if you want to measure this, or if you want to induce this, there's an emotion task I always thought was kind of a bizarre experience for participants, where you have them read aloud sentences that like make them feel sad or happy. That's an emotion induction. So you could have a method for emotion inductions. It's whatever you've come up with that you think would be useful to other people. And then there's a catch-all category here for other types of articles. Brief reports is a type of article. It's still just an empirical article. It's just a practical thing where you want it to be shorter. It's usually for, say, like one study or an exploratory design. Comments and responses. Coming from an experience with media violence, some parts of media psychology they're much more debated and sort of hot, like, and then people get angry about them. Media violence is one of them. And so if you looked up famous media violence scholars, you would see that they are much more involved in comments and responses than your average psychologist. It's just a part of their career now. What happens is they will publish a paper, and then someone who opposes their viewpoint will write a commentary. And the commentary, again, is a type of article. So if you go into editorial manager for psychology of popular media, you'll see that you can submit an article, a brief report, a commentary. I write editorials for them, so that's one of the categories. But it's a category of papers. The majority are journal articles. We take literature reviews, we take replications. But comments and responses, to me, it's usually something I don't want to be involved with in any way, because it's highly critical and it gets personal. Yeah, I haven't had anything where I feel like I need to make a commentary on anything, but definitely if you're in media violence, you would have to. And there's different ways to do this nowadays. Some journals, like I believe the JAMA journals have where you can respond to the research like with posts. Horrifying. Never. Do not want that. So of course you have to be a published author, presumably, to get your comments. Well, maybe not. It's usually you probably are, but maybe not. I guess presumably if you just have something meaningful to say, then it'll be evaluated as such. But we're assuming you know a lot about it, or you wouldn't be professionally commenting a criticism against something. Some journals have book reviews. I think they tend to do this more in communication than in psychology. I think they're valued more in communication. I'm really grateful that people do them because I did not know this before I started writing books, but if your book gets a professional book review, then it's probably going to get more sales and more readers. Writing academic books will never get you rich. So, you know, like I'm not dying for the $2 I'm going to get from somebody, but just exposure. You want, for me, it's just I want my ideas to be out there. In fact, the first edition of the Oxford Handbook of Media Psych, Nick Bowman, who I did not know at the time, wrote a review of it, and I was so grateful. And it's amazing to read a review of a book that you've written. You've just dedicated a chunk of your life and your energy to this thing, and someone, if they're reviewing it, you know, positively, it's an amazing feeling. Erica Shar, who I didn't know prior to that, but we're now friends, she wrote a review of my book, How Fantasy Becomes Reality, and it was published in Sex Roles, which is the top journal in gender research. And I had a chapter in there about gender. So that's an amazing thing. And that's how people find your book, really, book reviews. Editorials, as the editor, you know, like when you think of editorials, you think of op-eds, maybe from the New York Times or something, but the things that I write at the beginning of the journal, that's called an editorial. It's because I'm the editor and I'm just telling you about something that's coming up in the journal. It's not really an op-ed. It's a, hey, here's a journal and here's some stuff that's in it. You could have letters to the editor, you could have obituaries. There's a whole journal of the history of psych in which there are professional obituaries, basically like, tell me about this person's research and a little bit about them as a person as well. So those are all possibilities. Anyone could write a historical piece about someone's research. I'm sure they contact their close colleagues to write the obituary of a famous psychologist. Oh, and I did not put number 10 in here, which is student papers. You know what that is, but I can say more about it. But I basically covered it earlier when I was just saying the expectations are different. I have different expectations for someone who's in my social psych class as a graduate student than I would for an undergrad who's writing a paper about body image, than I would for an advanced grad student who's working their way towards their dissertation, because a dissertation is one of the types of papers that a professional writes, or a thesis is, but it's its own thing. And we know what it is because we live it and breathe it. You know, it's the paper that gets you your degree, basically. And it comes with the advice of a committee. So it has peer feedback for sure, but the document itself is not peer reviewed in a traditional way. So if you look in the search engines, you'll see there's checkboxes for, do you want me to pull dissertations? That means, do you want me to pull the document that got the person their degree? If it's their dissertation, but then they write it up for a publication, then it's classified as a journal article and it's an entirely different animal. And usually if there is one, you want to use the journal article for that, for the paper that you're writing, because the dissertation itself is very long usually and not peer reviewed, can be tighter in the publication paper, and it's going to benefit from anonymous feedback. So classroom papers, everyday types of papers and assignments versus theses and dissertations, that's a whole host of different kinds of student papers. I will say one thing about student papers. your professor is not the audience. So often, especially in undergrad papers, people write them to me, and you should not, because the problem is, I've read the article and I'm a social psychologist, so you don't have to explain things to me, but you do have to explain things to your audience. So don't be like, Karen, that thing that happened in that, like, no, it's not about me. Don't write it to me. Write it to your colleagues. You're preparing to be a professional, so don't assume anything. Tell me what definitions are, and tell me what happened in research. Don't confuse me with your audience. I get it. I'm your audience, like I'm giving you the grade, but I'm not your audience. I personally am not your audience. Your academia is your audience, or whatever the particular paper is. And I'll say that on top of this. So even these different papers do genuinely have different audiences, and you do have to understand that. So I'm working on this paper about parasocial phenomena in children, and it's for the journal JAMA Pediatrics. It has a bunch of top authors, Brad Bond and Tracy Gleason and Nancy Jennings and all these people. And what I'm trying to do with the team as the lead author is remind us all, it's not the typical paper you write, because it's going to be published in JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association Pediatrics. And one of the primary readers of that is pediatricians. So they're medical doctors, they're not psychologists. A lot of them are into it for practical reasons, like if I see a patient, what do I want to ask them about their parasocial relationships, or what should I understand about their parasocial relationships? It's not for your peers who are also doing parasocial research. It's for a different audience. So I would write a parasocial paper very differently in psychopopular media than I would for pediatrics, than I would for, like I've written for, I got an invitation to write for a German magazine about television once. Was writing about Black Panther. You just always have to know your audience, and that gives you some kind of guidance as to how deeply you should explain something, what you should assume they understand, including methods. I once wrote a paper, co-authored a paper for a humanities journal, and they really did not want us to put our numbers in there or our statistics test, because that is weird to them. That's like, why are you speaking in numbers? But I explained to them, I have to put some of these numbers in there. Like, you're not using APA style, but this is an empirical article. And if I'm making these claims, I do need to tell you why, upon what am I basing these claims? So we kind of struck a compromise with that one. In my defense, they did say in their aims and scopes that they published psychology research. And so, but I would leave stuff out there, which I would never leave out in a psychology journal. So audience is a huge thing when you're writing. Space is a huge thing. How long do you have to say anything? So there's lots of considerations when you're writing these types of papers. All right, so that's a lot. Let me know anything you're thinking, what you're wondering about. Might you ever write one of these?
It's so helpful just to have a background, and I kind of feel like, this lesson might be useful like midway through maybe a PhD program, just to give aspiring academic writers just some context about how to go about it.
Yeah, and now this is all on a YouTube channel, so people can get them anytime.
Yeah.
If you ever want a nerd to speak in your ear, I am there to just, and while you're waiting for your oil to be changed, I'm there. But that's the way it should be. Like, education should be available. Not that many people want to run and get into our nerdy details, but it's true. Like, until you've experienced it, you don't know what it's like. And so I'm hoping to demystify some of it.
It's very, very helpful. Karen.
Thank you.
I think certainly for me, it's helpful to think this way before I have settled on something for my dissertation.
Yeah.
Because I mean, a 200-page anything is daunting.
Mm-hmm.
Coming from someone who doesn't have a writer's background. So I think it helps to have, here are the different types of orientations that a writer should take, and less confusion is always a good thing. So
And most professionals, I think, like if you're at a research institution, you're primarily going to try to publish quantitative empirical articles, probably. It does vary by specific discipline, like experimental research, especially more complex models, has been, when I was trained, the gold standard in social psychology. So I would know that depending on the journal I was going for, what they're into. And that's part of also reading, interpreting what the journal is interested in. Like Psych of Women Quarterly, I think of them as being very interested in theory and being very serious. Whereas other journals would have sort of humorous titles, they will not. So it's a tone too. You don't want to ring the wrong bell or whatever. You don't want to come to a journal that's expecting serious professionalism. I have to do this because I find it very hard to stay serious. But if I'm writing about some terrible thing, I'm not going to joke about it. But I would prefer to write about something I just enjoy more, writing about something that's lighter. But yeah, you gotta kind of see what is typically published there. They apparently like that, so that's what they want.
Yeah, this was super helpful. And I know you mentioned what we're going through, but my earlier comment earlier in the week, for those who weren't there, was that the toughest part of working on, for me, the lit review for the dissertation proposal is making that shift from student paper to research question, where you're no longer just saying, I saw these problems over here, someone should do something about that, and actually saying, this is how to solve for it, and I propose something to do, actionable to do with it. But I feel like I also learned from today that there's no one way to do that, because it totally depends on what type of article even if it's a manuscript for a dissertation, think about it as an article. I'm more taking transportation. I'm saying, well, people have already shown that it applies, the quality of the text and the information about paratextual information matters. So I'm not making a huge contribution to the theory itself beyond saying that it applies to this concept of AI generated storytelling. Versus I know Holly, you're getting really deep into the theoretical part. So I guess I realized my question from earlier this week has no easy answer, but it totally depends on which type of article you're going for.
Well, I think it's a really important general answer that I think one of the things that trips people up is that they feel like they could grab what feels like to me is just a hodgepodge of different articles that are kind of vaguely related to the topic they're doing. That's fine if you're a student, especially if you're undergrad. I just want to know that you can review some literature, but that's not at all the task of an empirical article. You're writing an argument and you're citing precedent like a lawyer. So you have to adhere closely to what's relevant. It's just like in the courtroom, what's relevant to my argument? Well, you might say, Perry, Green and so found that greater transportation into a narrative led to greater narrative persuasion or something. You could do that. Sometimes people just have a paragraph and they say, in this circumstance, in that circumstance, in that circumstance, and they just plunk some different citations in there. That's just saying, I'm going to run through this literature for you. Narrative persuasion has been shown in this context, that context, that context. And I'm just
That's literally what I did. I had a paragraph where I said it's been shown in these topics, and then I put a parentheses an example article for
one of my favorite ways people do it, because you can say a lot in a short space. Again, that's the goal of APA style. You're just banging that precedent down on the table, like here it is, here it is, here it is, it's been done. And let me spend more time now comfortably telling you about what this new technology is and how that might relate and all of that.
Yeah, and then I introed it by saying I'm not going to directly measure persuasion or persuasive outcomes, but just so you know, it's been shown in blah, 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 blah. So an implication, if my study is successful or my hypotheses are supported, is that these stories could also be persuasive, not just engaging.
Yeah, and that's perfect. Like, I'm usually trying to get people to not veer off, but that is not veering. That is strengthening your argument by quickly saying transportation has been demonstrated to be related to narrative persuasion. I'm going to give you a bunch of constructs, and in a small space, now you've covered a bunch of relevant things. And it is relevant because you're saying this is the next step. What's not good, and I think I mentioned this, is someone who puts 7 pages in their dissertation about details of neuroscience studies, and in no way are they using neuroscience measures. Like, no, that is not okay. There's a bunch of stuff, sorry, I'm a very like laissez-faire type of person, but a bunch of stuff is not okay in this context. So I can't just say like, you be you, go with flow. Like, I would do that if you were just dancing randomly or whatever, but I'm supposed to be like your helper of pointing out what people are going to expect. That's what my job is. Like, when you give this to someone in the world, I want you to be super confident that you've avoided some pitfalls. And so I'm telling you what I think they would say about that. And of course, I will repeat this many times. I make all the mistakes all the time. I get pulled into a thing where I'm in love with something and I just need to say it, and I'm not realizing I'm doing it. And so thankfully, I don't write many things just by myself. Side note, I wrote all How Fantasy Becomes Reality by myself in like 9 months, and it had a horrifying lack of any editing, like no editing, like only copy editing. I'm like, you're just gonna let me say stuff, okay? And that's Oxford. They have like, the sample chapter that I wrote was peer reviewed, and then I made, and also Brad Bushman was carefully working with me as like, what topics will I cover? He gave me some editorial feedback, which I did use. But other than that, I just was left alone to say whatever. So that's weird. It's a weird feeling. Like, I almost wanted to say, you don't want to just let me say stuff. Like, you want to like stop me from saying a bunch of stuff, but they did not. But some, I have written some papers. I wrote a paper on domestic violence once where Evan Stark was the editor. And I said to him, you need to be an author on this paper because you've edited so much. It makes me sound so brilliant, by the way. I would never write like that. He is a different writer than I am, and it sounds like Evan. It doesn't sound like me. But he was very, he wanted something and he wanted me to do that. And so it turned out to be more like what he would have said. And that's fine because he's great. But I felt guilty, like, you've now written this paper, you need to, it's not that bad, but still he did. He just was incredibly hands-on. Like, some editors are incredibly hands-on and they want it the way they want it. I tend to be the type of editor where I will stop things if they're wrong, or I will help people not say things that I think will personally be bad for their career or that I think is erroneous, or I will try to get them to add stuff that I think would be interesting to their reader, but they're in control. I mean, like with the Oxford Handbook of Media Psych, they're an expert. Like, I'm not going to tell them to be a different person or write it in a different way because they're an amazing scholar. So I don't need to do that. Different needs in different situations. I get all kinds of different papers at the journal, and some of them have an undergrad as the first author. Maybe it's their honors thesis, their senior honors thesis. They're from all around the world. So it varies in terms of methodological or theoretical soundness. So it's much more broad than if you invite 25 people who you already know are going to nail it, right? It's a different role. But I have to say, I don't know, like, many things that I teach, I was never taught in grad school, many things. And it's not a criticism. My grad school education was fantastic. It's just, I don't know, it varies. Like, my mentor is different. He's very statistical. We spent a lot of time on statistics, spent a lot of time writing code. And also, to me, media violence hypotheses are pretty much self-explanatory. I mean, it's a simple concept. You don't have to go around the barn to understand why if you were exposed to a certain kind of content, it might influence you in the same way. It's not complex to me. It's a very simple idea. So, you know, I don't know, it doesn't need the kind of the same type of approach. And it's so much research has been done on media violence, and like the identification literature is just different. You know, it's smaller. There's many things about it that are just different. So, and you know, also I should say, like, everything varies. You never know what you're going to get when you submit something to a journal, and the same article that you submit to one journal and gets rejected, another journal will really love it. You know, maybe a better fit. Maybe the reviewers you just happen to get were more the type of people who would like that. There's subjectivity in it for sure. And I also didn't know as much about how many times, not like how many, like it's a lot, but generally, if I had to submit something to 3 different journals, that would be a lot. Most of the time things get accepted after a couple of journals, or just at the first one after different revisions. But also, you can't generalize from my mentor. He's very good at getting things published. So I can't generalize his experience to the rest of the world or anything. So everything is new in that way. You know, and I also am very interdisciplinary. I work a lot in communication, and my education was as a social psychologist, full stop. So things just vary. Things that you do after you get your PhD are different than you may have expected. But it's just the greatest thing, just being able to express ideas. And the first time you ever get anything published, it's sort of unbelievable. It just, when you see it in print, it just feels like magic, and it still does for me. You just can't believe that someone's actually publishing something that you wrote, an idea that you had. You know, it's going to take a long time, but then it's like that idea I had that day became that paper. That's amazing.
I will say too, one thing like in tandem to what we covered today that's been super helpful to learn is, and Stephen, I think you mentioned this earlier, but I totally went in with this idea that like I'm producing this 200-page manuscript, when in reality, if you do it really well, it's much shorter. And like Monica, that review was so helpful to look at, because I mean, it's 12 pages, but you cover, like, you feel complete when you get to the end of it because you've explained every variable you're working with.
Oh,
And
thank you so much.
it's a huge topic, right? Like there's so many
Yeah.
rabbit holes that you could have like gone into but didn't need.
Oh, I'm sure there's so many rabbit holes I did go into that Karen probably pulled me out of. But that's all part of it, right?
And I also like too, like even with your 5C model, like not every section is the same length. And I think for me, that helped me be like, oh, it's okay. Like, you know, I talk about things in relation to how much they help my argument or how much explanation they need for what I'm doing, versus I think more in my student paper phase, I was like, if I'm going to talk about the antecedents, each one needs to be, you know, the same length and the same amount of coverage and same detail.
Yep. All
Well,
about that argument.
I'm glad
Hey,
you brought
Monica,
that up. Mhm.
what
Go
was
ahead.
the topic, Monica?
Oh, I built some models to predict COVID-19 vaccine status based on things like media preference and vaccine conspiracy theories and stuff.
Oh my God, I would love to see that.
Sure, I'll send it. No problem.
I mean, seriously, thank you.
That's great stuff. Yeah, so know this too, it doesn't have to be 200 pages long. I think maybe mine was only because Craig wanted me to include in appendices a bunch of SAS outputs, which is like our SPSS. He said that because technology was different at that time, and he wanted to make sure I would have them handy for me whenever I went to write it up as a journal article. but the body of it wasn't that long. And you don't have to make it that long. It is just as long as it needs to be to explain your argument. You know, the one you turn in for grad school definitely can be longer and maybe will be longer than the one you turn into a journal, because journals will have a page limit of 24 pages or something. And so that's how long you have to write it in. But yeah, don't feel that you have to write 200 pages. And if you're going to try to publish it, you would go for the alternative dissertation. It's I think they're A and B or something that they have in there. The purpose of that was supposed to be that you could take the whole B section and it would be a journal article, and the A is kind of, I mean, the beginning section of that format is supposed to be kind of like just a standalone lit review, as if you wrote a lit review that's relevant to your journal article, and then you wrote the empirical paper. That's what that is supposed to be. Brian has even said maybe we need to create another format in which it's just the journal article, because it's weird reading them because they're a lit review and then you're like, I have already heard all this. Why are they repeating it? Because the format asks you to repeat it, and it's bizarre, but I think it's because of that. A whole lit review on your, thing, and then the actual study, that's the way it's supposed to be written up.
Can you tell me that when you say 24 pages for a published article, is that double spaced 12 point Times New Roman, the way that we're in APA style, including all the references?
So it's different for each journal. And so I go to this website called, I think it's, what is it? Words to Pages. I think it might be called wordstopages.com. But I just Google it until I find it. It's one of those things where if you plug in the number of words and then the font and then the size and then whether it's double spaced or not, it tells you how many pages that would be. So
Okay.
a lot of times the journal will just say 8,000 words or something like that. And then they'll
Okay.
tell you, does that include the references? Does that include the tables and figures? So it'll have all of that information on there. And yeah, and it can change by article type. Like we have an article submission and it maybe doesn't include the references, but in the brief reports, the page limit or the word limit does include the references. So you just have to look at exactly what you're submitting and translate it. So if you know, well, you don't have to translate it. I just use it as a ballpark figure. If I'm writing it up and I know the body needs to end around page 24, I'll be having that in mind, but you still have to use the word count, because like at our journal, you have to put in your cover letter that what the word count is.
Okay.
Before you put it in there.
Okay. Thanks. That helps, because I've just been sort of unsure about that. And frankly, having that include references to me is really scary, because I've always erred on the side of too many references. And now I'm realizing, like, you really want to be super surgical about the references if you're going to be publishing.
Yeah, that's really a whole topic in its own, because I was the same way. Part of it is you're just being more inclusive and you're pointing towards more related research. But yeah, sometimes, fairly often, you're going to be somewhat restricted by how many references you can put in, because those references are printed pages in a journal. And as editor, I get like 600 pages a year. That's it. So if you're going to cite twice the number of references, then that's a problem, because other people, you're taking a page from somebody else, right? That's how I think of it.
Right.
But then again, I mentioned at some point, each journal article doesn't get cited as much as you would think. Like it's definitely less than 10 is the average number of citations any a journal article gets. And so you're doing the authors a favor. You're usually writing about it because it's just relevant. But yeah, restricting the references means it's like setting your house on fire and telling you to run out with certain items, like, oh, I've got to have my laptop, then you just get the laptop. But if you could have a truck and just fill it up, you would fill it up. So it does make it like, what do I have to say? When I did the book for Fielding University Press, I think they call it, Jean-Pierre is in the humanities. He's the editor of Fielding University Press. And this is perfectly within his rights and is perfectly acceptable. He said, try to cite as few things as possible because a book audience is different from a journal audience. And it's true, if you put lots of references in your book, it'll make the book longer, but it'll be stuff they skip over, or it'll just be in the end. And they don't have, it's not as restrictive with publishing a book. They generally let you be pretty lengthy with a book. But yeah, first of all, you probably won't be writing it in APA style because non-researchers aren't used to having the names stuck in the middle of sentences like that. It can be distracting. So they might prefer like an AMA style or something where there's just a little number. And nowadays you can just change the entire style if you use reference software. And that's a tip about publishing a book. There are things that a really strong publisher will do for you for free that a small publishing house, you'll have to do it yourself. When I was writing my first book, I talked to Dorothy Singer, who's a child media psychologist, and she said, make sure they are paying for the indexing of your book, because people do that for a career. They index books. You give them the book, they read it, and they form index terms, and they put the page numbers in there. If you have to do that yourself for a whole book, it's difficult and time consuming. And so and you don't want to pay someone to do it out of your own pocket. So that's something you look for in a contract when you publish. What parts are they doing? Are they marketing? Are they doing the index? Do they pay for the images? If they have copyright things in there. So these are some things to look for.
And then also you couldn't do that indexing until after the book itself was laid out.
Yep. So books go through a whole phase where, just like publishing a journal article, you can make some changes at the very end, just even small things. But then once it goes down the tube there to the system, it's set in stone. So you're not changing anything. You only can change something if it's like a huge error or, like minor copy editing, but you're not going to change it after that. So same with the book. You're done. There's no adding anything else in there because they've sent it to India. A lot of these things are in India and they are indexing it for you. So there's no changing the pages at that point. And at Oxford too, there's a whole art department. So you don't design your cover or anything, they give your concepts to an artist and they make, sometimes they give you 2 covers to choose from. You try to tell them some ideas. But your ideas, I think my ideas were way off. They were too granular, whereas the book cover is usually very broad. I liked what they chose for the Oxford Handbook of Media Psych. It's do I have that? Yeah, it's this one. They just chose like a generic avatar. And this was like in 2013 or something like that. So I thought that was cool. People were like, is that supposed to be you? But yeah, my like, I'm not good at visual art, let's just say that. And so my ideas were all like a lot of people chatting, or it was like too busy. It needs to be something you can take in the gulp. But yeah, those are all just interesting things I never thought I was going to be working on books during my career. I thought when I'm very old and now can't move or something, I'm going to be like writing some books. But so it's the whole thing I learned by doing it. Well, I think we were at the end of our time. Thank you for coming and for your patience while I got the recording going. And I will see you all soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.